What a privilege. I mean, it's to be involved in this. It's great. There's kind of no doubt some kind of actual humans out there. It's it'd be kind of great to kind of hear where you're all coming from. So I don't know what feedback we've kind of got within this forum, but it'd be awesome to kind of find out kind of where you're all from. So, however, kind of you're watching this, please do kind of comment or kind of give some feedback. Okay, so elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's pretty hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So bear with me. So to set the scene, I'm in a lift. Yes, American friends, we really do call them lifts. And four people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close and I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I hear the doors seal shut behind me and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important to her. I gesture, see? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods. Oh, okay, perfect. The CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what were the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me I don't know what teams are really doing what, the volume of risk, and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing policy is slow and often hard to communicate, and people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do. But I'm then left playing catch up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, trying not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person in the suits. Look, slightly less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker. Okay, what's important to you? Managing risk. So mostly opportunity risks. The fear of missing out, getting features out the door, and avoiding getting bogged down with, as they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that seems almost designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Oh, okay. How did you get in my imagination? Okay, I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person. Hoodie, headphones around the neck. Yes, my stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write? I ask. It doesn't really matter, but Python, cool. Okay, have you got everything updated to work with? I pause. Python 3, they say? Yes, Python 3, that must be hard. They don't know it yet, but I've just won a bit of their trust, which is important. Nearly, they say. Cool, well, what's important to you? So staying on top of patching dependencies so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, what I can break, and what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debt, and the rest of my team effectively being able to cohesively work as though we were one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, tools, the usual. Great, I say. I write code too. Let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code. Here's my public GPG key. So you know that you can trust what I have to say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and when it changes? Well, we get a memo or something stuck to the notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. Well, how does that work out? Well, it's then up to us to maintain the to-do list so we can then onboard new people. Does it go wrong at all? Well, yes, sometimes if we compile that operational manual wrong, we miss a memo or we don't apply them in sequence and we get things wrong. They glanced apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide in the meeting room on the third floor that was being used as a dedicated war room, and we went ahead and wiped all their boards down. I looked to the dev. Sound familiar, I ask? They nod. Okay, well, it turns out that we're not all special snowflakes, hey? Well, all is not lost. I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here today. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way to stop obstructing it, I answer, well, I don't actually work here. I'm just actually here to fix the lift. People have been complaining that it only goes to the top floor no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading to the stairs. The doors shut, and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of that sounds familiar and you can relate to my imaginary friends, then I've got some answers for you. What if I said you could update policy easily, maybe even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month? What about 10 updates in a single day, all seamlessly communicated to the people that need to consume it, all without derailing them? You can have visibility on this compliance using tools that you perhaps already have in place. And that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, and make sense, not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to, and not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate effectively like a linter over your code. So you can run compliance checks locally in CI and then ultimately guard production. Multiple versions of the policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's a known vulnerability in an old version type updates are in effect a business as usual activity to communicate. Sound interesting? Okay, hang around. Doing good for time. Cool. Okay, so I've hopefully maybe got your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt Smith. I'm currently an instructor for Learn K8 and also Control Plane. I'm a consultant to the Crown Prosecution Service in part of UK Gov at the minute, but have been elsewhere, and a tinkerer of a fair amount of open source things. I spent a fair chunk of my kind of professional career now working across bits of UK government and very large organisations where problems like these are rife. I've been promised, or hopefully we'll have plenty of time, if anything else, for questions and your best heckles at the end. So please, if not, you can find me afterwards and send me an email or something. So, given that I've got the luxury of a live audience, though I'm not sure I'll be able to see your responses, if you could perhaps maybe, even if you're in your own room watching this without a camera or anything, and you've got no other way to tell me, raise your hand and tell me if you are with my policymaker. So if you're with my CIO and you've written, applied, or any sort of policy before, so maybe some coding standards, linting, any security controls, maybe anything like that that you've written and defined. Either write policymaker if there's a chat, or if there's or just raise your hand in your room. Right, policymaker if you can. Cool. Okay, next round. So if you've ever sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with at least some good intention, shall we say, leave a comment of policy breaker or put your hand up now. You fell for it. So thanks to the organisers of the conference, we've got all of your employers, your names and employers' details down. So can I put your phones down, lend me your ears. The stakes just got raised a bit. So where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, so maybe tabs being 2 or 4 space indentated, maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which is then the open door to case by case exemptions being required when you come up against a situation that you weren't anticipating. So this is not unlike the laws of the land and how they were created, with case law making for a complex to navigate rulebook and harder still to then measure for compliance. This can often look like the thin bit of a wedge, where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with others looking to expand upon its scope, which can lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure is actually worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software. So why does this all have to be so hard? There must be a better answer. Well, we've codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we generally do it wrong. So maybe some of you are screaming your favorite product name at me in your heads as the solution. And you're not wholly wrong, but the devil is in the detail. So throwing some curly braces or commonly YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep that policy a secret as well. Exposing it could be used against you by an adversary. However, that does not support us shifting left at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. Therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see that perhaps in the scenario of a application deploy, midway through finding that one resource was non-compliant and rejected could leave the overall deployment in an inconsistent halfway state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which might beg the question of, was the policy better than the downtime? Especially if it leads your engineers are all hopefully plenty smart people at finding inventive, should we say, ways around the computer says no response that they've got. This is then further exasperated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong, so you form that case law and need to apply a new policy. Maybe say all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policy, which is great so long as someone sees them. But if your organization has adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD in some fashion, is anyone seeing those warnings? I mean, who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest at least you're probably missing the point of CI/CD. You should be able to trust your job status. Okay, I'm not here today to just throw stones. So if we remember my implied promises to my four imaginary friends at the start of what this kind of future promised land might look like. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved these problems elsewhere. We just actually need to be reminded of them and join the dots. Well, the first is something, if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not, however, be doing is then making that visible. So at least inner source this, by which I mean allow anyone within your walled garden of employers, suppliers, employees rather than suppliers, etc., to see the policy. I'm not saying give all your threat monitoring and intel rules away. You can probably keep all of that to yourself. But I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime when reverse engineered workarounds and ultimately opaque legacy exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks the ability to work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and then ultimately only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a start. Our policy is visible now to those that need to be able to see it. So many of you are no doubt used to and familiar with semantic versioning, but a quick recap and in context to this. So the first segment is to indicate a breaking change, perhaps conflicting one. So in the context of policy, well, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. So maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not really judging. The increments of that might look like that requiring to be from a predetermined list rather than just being free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes that shouldn't break anyone. And increments of that might look like correcting a spelling mistake in one of the department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes. So these should be a no-brainer to keep up to date with. And increments of that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository now. It's versioned so we can easily communicate the policy. We can tack on release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? So you might unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, so our policy is visible in the repository. It's versioned, so we can easily communicate that policy. We can tack on release notes. Expectations are managed by Semver. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know testing is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend on and also provide some known good examples, codified tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and also serve as potential side effects before they hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing everyone. So as a bonus from that, we should find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Okay, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. And we can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependabot or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull request tests, even auto merging if you like. Okay, so to check you're still awake, can anyone tell me a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? Hopefully, at least someone's thinking it, but remember Christmas last year. But yeah, as you know, all presentations this year are contractually required by the organisers of the conferences to reference Log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes. In just a few short months, I can remove these and hopefully just point broadly at a list of scary looking CVEs in order to command your behaviour through fear. But what I'm getting at here, though, is the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something your organization is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can then allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing, and it's not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. It's time to now look at how you might be actually able to do this, and I know you all really came here wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! But to maintain scope, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things just to prove that it's not one tech or tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy to invent much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could use some or even all, probably. In this case, Chekhov's going to be doing my Terraform and Caverno will be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization here. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code that's on the screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that I made a real thing. The link to this will be at the end as well. So the policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts at version 1.00. I've got policy that requires that department label on all resources. So long as it's set, doesn't matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so note how the passing test cases are useful as a great example of what good and bad looks like. We've pushed a tag in Git. I've added release notes. I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which of course it does. But moving on, version 2, well, that looks similar, only now that department field has to be one of, has to be one of a predetermined list. So like before, test exists, release notes are written, and tags are signed. 2.1.0 is where we notice and correct a spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of departments. And 2.1, and I've now added a new department to the list. A few more repositories in that organization. So app1 and infra1, they depend on version 1.0 of the policy, and it's not compliant with version 2 or beyond. But how do I know that? Well, I've configured Renovate in this case, which is a product from Mend, or now, yes, it is now Mend, was White Source, to automatically make me a pull request. When there's a new version of the policy, so it becomes super obvious if I can update my dependency and I can see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over the organization, which allows me as a very crude fashion to measure the compliance of my policy. Moving on from that, app 2 and infra 2, a couple more repos, they depend on version 2.0 of the policy. However, we could merge the open pull request there all the way up to 2.11. Finally, app 3 and infra 3, well, they're dependent on 2.11 and they get a gold star from the CIO. There is a small touch of some magic and it's not especially pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I've probably definitely written worse. But what this does is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy that I've declared it is compliant with. Ideally, this might be less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome. And the last piece to the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the policy to all be accepted and evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. So Kubernetes gives you admission controllers. It's not so easy to get the same policy evaluation in cloud. They've got their own policy code. I've not figured out how to be able to evaluate that locally. Again, pull request, contribution, collaboration, all very welcome. So you may have noticed the way that the policy was designed, written, and also distributed lends itself well to coexist with itself in a single Kubernetes cluster. Which brings us to the cluster 1, another repository, which describes a cluster that accepts all the versions that we've described so far. Likewise, cluster 2, which only accepts version 2.0 and greater. We can automate all of this using Kind, which is Kubernetes in Docker, for CI to deploy the apps and prove that this all works as expected. And then we have it. A full org, all done, all compliant, policy, all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on. So this is great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story of why it exists? So after all, if your kind of agile delivery teams are even half effective, they will reject anything they perceive as friction if they don't see the value in it. This could allow the process could allow your developers to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something that is outside of what the policy currently permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind an actual pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions with risks that inform the mitigations and then manifested as policy, maintained all as one narrative. So when the risk landscape changes, your policies can move with it. When some new privacy, when some new privacy regulation comes out, or your say latest marketing strategy pays off, and you acquire more data, for example, even if your policy was perfect one time, the risks and the appetite will stand still for no one. We can liken this to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, change is hard, and there is significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to risks that were more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is fundamentally needed, and the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. So now this is all really over to you. Honestly, the best thing you could do right now is tell me it's madness, already done, irrelevant, or otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber peers have yet to do. So beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building a case study with some more willing organizations and allow me to swap out more of my imaginary friends for real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together today is that, and please feel free to say this out loud with me, purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy, which I've been practicing saying far too many times. So I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now kind of free to leave for a little bit at least and grab a coffee. I'll destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn these days, and you can be rest assured there'll be no spam or much content at all, since I'm awful at self-promotion, especially on social media. cns.me just points to my LinkedIn, and talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and those are all open source too. Questions are very welcome on this or anything else. I'll be hanging around in the chat for a little bit, or kind of ping me a message on LinkedIn. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Let's wait for any questions for some time.
Sure.
Yeah. So these slides, is you're running PowerPoint or is this some different tool?
It's a different tool. I use MARP, but actually it's all HTML. So I write all the slides is Markdown. For the style of presentation that I do and I like, it fits much better. I don't care too much about like dragging things around and positioning stuff. So I can write everything as Markdown and everything then just consistently lands on the slides. And like for a presentation like this where there is 163 slides, doing that in PowerPoint would be really painful. So yeah, it's an open source tool called MARP, MARP. There's a few other alternatives around, like that do kind of similar of rendering Markdown to slides. But that's the one that I've used and have made a few kind of very minor contributions to it. But the guys who look after that is awesome, and you can do anything that you could do with HTML in it, which also kind of opens you to stuff. So if you like drop into a live demo, you can actually just land like an iframe in the middle of the slides to the thing that you want to actually show off, rather than kind of shifting in and out of a browser and stuff. So it can make the presentation quite slick.
Okay, that's great to hear. And the current one, the cns.me, the one which is showing animation, it's a GIF, which is a GIF image.
No, that's just CSS.
Oh.
Same as the emoji on the first slide. So it's just some CSS that's making it glitch.
Okay.
But you can see all the code for it on. I'll paste a link in the chat. But yeah, that's got all the code for this and other talks, so you can see actually how I author a talk and look at the actual markdown. So the markdown for this talk looks like this one.
Okay.
Also means that I've got the luxury of I don't need to worry about emailing things around, worrying about fonts or anything. I can rock up, use any computer, and just go that's got an internet connection to present from.
Nice, that's great.
Thanks.
So you have kept your calendar free for December, or it's not updated? I see in November you're speaking 3 sessions.
Yeah, I've only got a few currently that are committed in the diary. There's not much in the way of conferences that are currently happening in December. It's all yeah, I've kind of gone as far as November at the minute. But yeah, just back from talking at KubeCon earlier this week. It's all a blur from flights and long haul flights.
Folks, please let us know if you have any questions. Chris is here to answer them for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Or about anything else, similarly, slide deck questions or anything else.
Hello, Vanessa. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Yeah, I just want to
Can
do
you
a
hear me?
tech check. Yeah, I just want to do a tech check before we begin.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So we will start the session in next 10 minutes. And
Sounds
at the
great.
end of the session, we'll have Q&A. If anybody has any questions, they can ask.
Perfect.
Sure.